What up, perps? Kid Copious back in effect. Purple State Party. You know what we're doing here? Repping America, the center, and common sense. And as always, I dedicate this show to all the grinders out there, man. I know how hard it is. I'm one of them. Today's going to be somewhat of a interesting show, a little bit of a tough show. I'm going to have to delve into a little bit inside here, Kid Copious. You know, I would lay odds on whether or not I start tearing up. All right, let's kick it off. All right, so this just came out on April 28th. The Education Department issued a resolution agreement from the Office of Civil Rights that gives UPenn 10 days to voluntarily comply with three demands, issuing a statement affirming compliance with Title IX, restoring accolades to female athletes misappropriated by transgender athletes, and sending individual letters to the affected athletes. If Penn does not comply with the demands, the university risks referral to the Department of Justice for enforcement proceedings. Of course, UPenn says, well, we were following NCAA rules and regulations. Well, it's still a violation of Title IX. Doesn't matter if it's the NCAA who violates it or UPenn. Both are guilty of doing it. And while I have sympathy for transgender people, this is one of those issues where common sense just sort of has to reign. As I don't even know the word how I would phrase that. But it's a very controversial subject, and some people don't even want to weigh in. Some people just weigh in with complete and utter blind support or blind hatred, and that's not what I'm trying to do. But I'm glad that female athletes will once again get the recognition that they deserve. So this one popped up. It really doesn't have much to do with the letter J, which is this week's letter. But I just wanted to share this because in this article, which came from Rolling Stone, of all places, really, Rolling Stone, it really illustrates some points that I myself think are vitally important. It's like a war zone. What happened when Portland decriminalized fentanyl? And look, this is not a bashing of Portland either, okay? This is, well, we'll just get into it. You'll see, So the article starts off, about an ambulance driver rushing to the scene. The ambulance driver, in this case, a guy named Justin De Jesus, jabs the man's shoulder with a shot of, I can't pronounce that, basically Narcan to reverse the effects of fentanyl, the hyperpotent synthetic opioid that is driving the U.S. overdose epidemic. His ambulance partner applies an oxygen mask, and slowly the man's breathing picks up. After a quick knuckle rub to the sternum, he stirs back to life. Hostage to his addiction, the man shows no gratitude. He won't give his name and bristles when asked if he'd like more help. Before the first responders have even packed up their kit, he disappears around the corner, presumably to score again. This is the sad part. If someone overdoses to the point where they have to be revived, they tend to seek out that dealer because, in their words, that's the good stuff. They'll just do a little less so they won't die. But since there's no standardization, you could be getting a fentanyl pill that has nothing in it or a 10,000 times the standard dosage, so you drop dead. You get that? Like, you OD, and because you OD'd, you're like, that's the good shit, man. And you go and you search out that dealer, telling yourself, hey, just do a little less next time. Whew. In September 2024, ending in September 2024, over a 12-month period, 87,000 Americans died from overdose. More lives than were lost in Vietnam, Afghanistan, and Iraq combined. Although the death toll is down significantly, Oregon and other Western states have lagged behind the downward national trend, making them ground zero of a decade-long fentanyl crisis. I mean, and to make it worse, in 2020, Oregon voters, when we were all stirred up by that fake indignation that everybody was showing, Oregon voters decriminalized small amounts of drugs. And for the most part, the police pulled back from really enforcing sales or anything like that. And, it spiraled out of control. Many addicts in Oregon use fentanyl and psychosis-inducing forms of meth in tandem, raising the likelihood of fatal overdose and making it even harder for them to seek treatment. The meth that's coming in, the precursor chemicals coming over from China, going to the Mexican cartel. Although, for 60 grand, you could set up your own little center, I guess, to make it. Factory would be a better word, eh? They don't separate the precursor chemicals. So instead of just meth, you end up with this, psychosis-inducing form of meth. In other words, people do the drugs and they're quickly insane, So then in January of 2024, Portland made national headlines when the governor declared a 90-day state of emergency to tackle the fentanyl crisis. Within months, state lawmakers voted to repeal Measure 110, ending a nearly 4-year experiment with decriminalization. All right, so what it's back to now is, basically you either go to jail or you go to a community-based addiction treatment, which is not really heavily enforced, so a lot of times people just walk in and walk out again, and the cycle continues. And it's the cycle that needs to be broken. The story went on to talk about, and I really urge you to read the whole story. I'm just giving you the bits that I feel are important. But one of the central characters, I guess you could say, in this is a guy, last name Mejia. And he's talking about how, he's waiting for this guy, Bruce Ferguson, to show up. Okay. And Bruce started taking Adderall and later pot to deal with teenage anxiety. He fell in with a troubled crowd, and a Percocet prescription after a dental operation segued into a heroin addiction that got him kicked out of the family home. Then came fentanyl. It's not how it used to be, he says. It controls every decision you make. With a powerful high that wears off in less than an hour, some addicts are compelled to use upwards of 20 to 30 times a day, leaving a fleeting windows of self-possession. Ferguson went on to say, people that you would never guess become users, and now within a couple days, months, they're homeless and they're out here. They lose everything, their families, their cars, their houses, their careers. This is not just a conservative Republican talking point. This is something that affects people across the board. Anyhow, Mejia was getting Ferguson ready to get into treatment. And so he shows up, to a place for a week stay at a recovery center. And, right at the last minute, he says, that he has to, go do something. He has a few more errands to run and he'll come back. But he never does. Because what people don't understand who don't do drugs or don't suffer from addictions are like parasites. They feed on you until you're dead. And they'll just draw you right back into that. Mejia is unfazed by Ferguson not showing up. He's been in and out of detox 16 times himself, and he knows better than anyone that the path to recovery is seldom a straight line. For me, it took a couple times. Once was court ordered. And, I thank God for that because, I got clean and sober. And then I thought, well, maybe I can handle it. And I started drinking again. And, at first, just having like a beer after work and stuff, it was all cool. But it quickly spiraled. And, I just checked myself in to a hospital because that's what you have to do. You can die. I lost a friend, Jimmy, who tried to go cold turkey. I don't recommend you go cold turkey, especially with alcohol. It can prove fatal. But, I checked myself in. I got clean off of meth and alcohol. And second time around, it stuck. It's been well over 30 years now. But, I don't forget that. Get to that in a sec, We'll talk about another guy here, Sean. He's 39 years old, and he grew up in a family that, that's what they did. They did fentanyl. He came from that. He was sort of born into that. He wants to stay sober, he says. He wants to get certified as a computer programmer. See, in a moment of clarity, he recognizes what he wants and what he's going to have to do for it. you know? But that doesn't, that doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to get the help they need, because you got to find that help, and it's not always there because, the priorities have been more on, handing out Narcan and giving out free pipes and, helping people to stay drug addicts, essentially. And that's really like, this other worker out there, Burke, she was talking about it, and she said, it doesn't need to be jail, but we used to have something called the Cheers van, where the drug of choice was alcohol. And if you passed out or were drunk, they would pick you up and you would go to the drunk tank and sober up. She says it has to be built a little differently because the drugs are different. But the fact that the people get to walk the streets and be aggressive on meth and have a machete is unacceptable. People deserve predictability. It's the baseline safety that people expect. And that's what we need. We need somewhere that blends traditional shelter housing, services, rehab clinics, doctors, and then a lot of space for people just to pitch their tents. If you want to live in a tent, because you don't like the walls, I guess, if you just want to be out there, that's the kind of stuff that we can do. Because we have to move it off of the streets and into a controlled environment. And it's not a controlled environment so that they can do drugs. It has to be set up to try to help these people get better again. Maybe not punish them if they slip up a little bit. Like Burke went on to say, she decries the lack of oversight on public funds earmarked for homelessness and treatment services, claiming that there are no hard deliverables for any contract that goes out the door. And that's part of the problem. We're seeing that in LA right now. The the federal attorney is looking into whether there was corruption or graft within the homeless program. And again, I don't bring this up as some sort of like anti-Democrat, anti-left point of view. I bring it up because we can't have that money being wasted. And right now, what we really see a lot of is them subsidizing homelessness and drug addiction. We're talking about, maybe the alternative, enforced treatment. And it's not a new concept. They've been using drug courts and other systems since the 1970s to compel people to get sober. And the approach is getting bipartisan momentum owing to the lethality of fentanyl. I'm a product of that. I had to complete the rehab treatment. When I completed the rehab treatment, I was able to get a job. I was able to stay at home with my mom and dad. In this article, the author mentions a half dozen recovering heroin and fentanyl addicts told me unequivocally that they never would have broken free without a nudge from the judge. I got rescued, not arrested, says one who now works for a recovery nonprofit. But, other people say that it's unethical and dehumanizing, and it does more harm than good. Most people already couldn't quit using drugs when they were facing a bunch of consequences. So when you come in and say there's going to be one more consequence, it's counterproductive. Well, that's the only way. Part of it is not just getting a person safely off drugs or alcohol, but keeping them in a situation where they could spend some time sober so they can really get their feet beneath them and start looking for a future, looking for why they want to build a future, and start looking for the resources to build that future. But, at the end of the day, it comes down to that individual wanting it. Mejia had a great segment at the end here, and we'll wrap it up with this. He adds a parting shot. I've learned that the disease of addiction has a hit on my life. What's colder than that? The hit man is me. So how I get militant and combat that is by doing what you are doing today and asking for help. Yeah, because that's what it comes down to. The individual person has to ask for help. If they are unable to, and I know for a fact that it is very difficult to ask for help when the addiction is fucking with your brain and the voices in your head are giving you every excuse in the book to not ask for help. That's my rule of thumb. I don't try to help people unless they ask for help, because I need to know that they're committed to it before I risk myself, my own sobriety. But I know, and I stand as a witness to this, that unless you force some people to get clean, they're not going to. My life was saved by that. I am one of those people who says I was not arrested, I was saved. And I thank the police officers. One of the reasons why I have the values that I have today is because a judge said, you know what? If you complete rehab, this all goes away. And I took that opportunity. But you have to be given that opportunity before you can take it. And that's what we need to start focusing on. We can't have these people out on the streets creating chaos when they need help. And whether or not that has to be enforced, I think that's up to the individual, not the state. If the individual wants to accept the help, great. If they don't want to accept the help, we need to have solutions. And those solutions don't have to be putting them in with a bunch of criminals. We can build facilities. We have the money. Hey, California especially, we're the fourth largest economy in the world. Why do we not have a state-of-the-art model for the world rehabilitation center where people are detained for X amount of days? They are given the resources needed to rebuild their lives and reconnect with family and friends, and the support and services that they need. Because I'll tell you this, they need help more than they need a clean crack pipe. All right, that was pretty heavy, so we're going to switch to a quick Babylon Bee here. Parents distraught after finding soccer ball under son's bed. Oh, that's great. Oh, yeah. I myself, I love soccer. My daughter played soccer. One of the ways I explain it is, if I'll get up at like 4 a.m. on a Saturday and watch Arsenal WFC Women's Football Club play on like a low-res YouTube channel, I must love soccer. But that's the way you should do everything in life. You should just be able to feel it. Trump administration agrees to settlement with family of Jan 6 rioter Ashley Babbitt. She was shot trying to enter the window. I think it was a bad shoot. Personally, it's funny to listen. It's funny when you go into the comments on that particular article, being USA Today, and how everybody is defending the cop who shot her, even though in other instances they defend the criminal who got shot, saying, "Oh, why didn't you shoot him in the leg?" I mean, I don't get it. So let's move on to another one. Monday is going to be Cinco de Mayo, which, contrary to popular belief, I guess, is not Mexican Independence Day. It commemorates a battle, like one single battle, the battle of, I'm going to butcher this, Puebla. I think it's actually Puebla de Los Angeles. Yeah, Puebla de Los Angeles, and that happened in 1862. Mexico was already independent at that time. That happened on September 16th, 1810. If I'm believing, yep. Let's see, did I get it right? Yeah, I have the Wikipedia article up here, but I wanted to see if I remembered it. But what's funny is when you look it up, one of the things you might find is the Economic Times article where they're talking about Corona beer actually co-opted the holiday to boost beer sales, which I guess makes sense because at the end of the month you got Memorial Day for all the Americans, and at the beginning of the month you got Cinco de Mayo, which is supposed to be for Mexicans. I kind of think that's kind of crazy, man. Like how so many of our holidays were just created to boost sales. I know some of my favorites were. This is why I love 4th of July. I'm already beginning my 4th of July planning. I mean, hell, I began my 4th of July planning on July 5th of last year. But it just cracks me up, Valentine's Day, Halloween, all these kind of manufactured holidays. It's just amazing. Capitalism can be quite amusing sometimes. So, we're going to start off the J segment here, and the first J is going to be Joe Biden's crimes and who's to blame. I found this kind of amusing because, one of the things that politicians do is if they're looking for a second term, they don't want to take a stance that might alienate some people. That's the great thing about where Trump's at right now is Trump. He's not going to get a third term. Okay. That's not going to happen. We could blah, blah, blah it all we want, but that's not going to happen. But he can act in this like kind of, crazy bulldozer of a way because he's not really trying to get reelected. Joe Biden was looking for a second term, so I don't really understand why he took such a far left stance. And I want to look at a few of these things. Immigration alone could have sank his reelection, but it's part of the party's plan, I think, so he kind of had to go along with it. So I don't know if he's really to blame. Recently, I don't know if you know this. I just found this out, so I'm not going to pretend that I was super genius and I know everything. But I found this out the other day. Trump televises his cabinet meetings. And so Rubio, who's the director of something, look, I'm not that guy. I'm not the guy who remembers all of these people and their titles. That's kind of secondary for me. But anyhow, Rubio says there's dossiers. And J.D. Vance says, me or Elon. And everybody kind of laughs. And Rubio did what I thought was a very classy move. He said, I'm going to give the people their dossiers and they can decide if they want to release it to the public. I mean, I assume Tulsi Gabbard was one of them. I mean, you know what Joe Biden did to Tulsi? He had air marshals following her. She was on a watch list for flights, part of their Quiet Skies program. They drew up dossiers on people like RFK. I'm sure J.D. Vance. Come on. We know they have a dossier on Trump, right? And as a side note, it's really weird. I just started watching The Apprentice again. It's on Amazon. And it's really weird watching Donald Trump interact with people, knowing that in like 20, not less than 20 years, he was going to be the president of the United States. But you see a different side of him, right? I kind of urge people to watch it, just so you could see like what Donald Trump was like back then, how he interacted with people. But anyhow, see, that's what they call a digress. But here's the meat of the matter. Here's the Joe Biden crime. Rubio also disclosed that Biden had what was called the Global Engagement Center. You have misinformation, right? It's wrong, but it may or may not be malicious, right? You have disinformation, which is just propaganda. It's wrong with a purpose. But they were also fighting a little thing called malinformation. Malinformation is true but bent, but at the same time, it could be true and it could be misbent. In other words, you can try to say that something is malinformation when it really isn't. A great example of that was the vaccine does not stop the spread of COVID. There's that word, right? They've got me afraid to say that word. Doesn't that suck? This is America, right? Why not? This is America, Bean. But anyhow, it's what you label as malinformation. You could say malinformation is true, but in opposition to the party's stance. Because if the party or the person is taking a fraudulent stance, a false stance, the one thing that would combat it is the truth. And Rubio said that one way that you really combat misinformation, disinformation, all that, is by free speech and transparency. But, Biden wanted to create dossiers on people. Another thing, another mess that he's in, when, back in the day, under Obama, Russia invaded Crimea. And Obama told the Ukrainian president of the time, it wasn't Zelensky, it was somebody else, he said, look, don't respond, we're not backing you. And Russia just marched into Crimea. And I think under Biden, Putin expected somewhat of the same response when he went into Ukraine. There are rumors, I believe it was Bob Woodward, the famed journalist, who said that when Biden heard that Russia was moving into Ukraine, he said, fucking Obama. So I don't know. This Ukraine mess that we find ourselves in, not necessarily just Joe Biden. I mean, think about it. DEI, that was his handlers. He couldn't care less. Radical theories, boys and girls spaces, riots, Jewish persecution. It was his handlers who allowed that stuff. It was his handlers who handed out the pardons, the preemptive pardons. He couldn't care less. Okay, Joe Biden cares about Joe Biden, and that's about it. All right, I'm not saying, I'm not comparing him to anybody. I'm just saying we know in this case that's what he was concerned with. He didn't really care, and he didn't have the capacity to really care. He had the capacity to be undermined and used. I find it funny. Hey man, I wore the Brandon shirts, but yeah. In final retrospect, he just sat there and people did shit around him, and that's what we have to undo. I had a piece planned on jobs. The one thing I would say, about just so I could include jobs in the title, if I decided to include jobs in the title, is where are the jobs going to be in the future? What's going to happen here in California? Is California going to become just, basically a paradise where only people in the entertainment and technology sector can survive because we destroy all of our manufacturing? Or are we going to reverse that course? Well, hopefully we are going to reverse that course, because Trump is seeking to pull our special dispensation for all of our, everything has to be electric vehicles, especially when it comes to transportation for goods and services. That's could be the one thing that saves California. Oddly enough, it might actually be Trump. It isn't going to be Gavin, and it's not going to be the Democrats. All right? Somebody's going to have to step in to save this, because we're eroding our jobs. But anyhow, I'm going to cut it short on that one. I want to talk about the Jews for a second. Columbia University, Harvard, other schools, they had these protests that spiraled out of control and ended up with pure anarchy and anti-Semitic behavior. As a biblical history and military history dude, I've always been inspired by Israel and the Jews. From the Exodus to the Holocaust, from the Six-Day War to October 7th, the people of Israel have endured. They've endured these hardships with this plucky determination that everybody should find inspiring. And last year's attack on Jewish students by radical lefties was some of the grossest shit I've ever seen. I've never seen such hatred on display from people who you thought were the cream of the crop. I think a lot of it was foreign students. I think that's something else that needs to be discussed. But I think what was done to Jewish students alone explains why so many Democrats ghosted their party at the election, because they didn't want to be a part of that. I know I wouldn't want to be a part of that. So moving on to the big J, Jesus. I follow him. I follow him my own way. I follow his lessons my own way. Some of the lost gospels sort of support the way that I support him, But the problem is man twists whatever he has to. He twists the words for power and control. As far as I'm concerned, abortion is not a sin. I don't understand why people label it that way. I don't see trans people as being an affront to God. One thing I personally believe, this is just me, is God is selecting an army to fight the army of evil. He's looking for soldiers who have enough, chutzpah to be on his side. And one way he does that is he tests us. He tests our behaviors and our reactions to things. He told us not to judge, because that's his duty. So if you can't live up to that, you might be in trouble. But it's, one of the ways that I look at God, Jesus, and all of that is some of the messages that the churches don't necessarily preach, or they preach in a slightly slanted way, or blah, 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 blah. You share the word. You do what I'm doing right here, saying, look, I believe, I'm not a member of a church. I do not consider myself to be of any denomination. I believe I was baptized as a Catholic, and I was baptized as a Mormon. But I'm none of those things anymore. I'm myself. But I share the word because the message is so damn important. You come together as a community, not as a hierarchy where there's leaders who tell you what you're supposed to believe. But you come together as a community where everyone is equal. You try to love your neighbor and you try to do good. And that's what coming together as a community is about. You don't need somebody to head up the so-called rescue party, do you? You just get out there and you do what needs to be done. If somebody's in trouble, you try to get them help. But above all, I think their message really was to live without judgment. I think that's really important. I just wanted to share that. So as we go to close this one out, I came across this and I just thought this really sums up a lot. Your periodic reminder that a cow cannot add a single atom of carbon to the atmosphere that wasn't previously removed from the atmosphere by a plant. Cows cannot increase atmospheric CO2. They merely recycle CO2. It's not a new source of CO2. And without the cows, bacteria would over time rot plant fibers and return the same amount of carbon to the atmosphere. But grazing cows help grass sod fix carbon in the soil, thus increasing soil fertility over time. The climate crusade is built on scientific fraud. And that dovetails right into Bronco's cartoon. This is an old one here that he brought back. Bernie Sanders' next bestseller, How to Make Millions Selling Socialism to Idiots. And that really got me thinking about all the things that they've monetized. Politics, hate, Cinco de Mayo, shitty behavior like assholes like Johnny Somali, right? The Columbia students, the Harvard students, lonely white women. Natural climate change, homelessness, drug addiction, medical treatments, Che Guevara, Jesus, Allah, and even God. It's all been monetized. I think that might be a new message moving forward, because as much as the left likes to call themselves the resistance, and, the right tends to think of themselves as patriots, we in the center are the resistance, and we are the patriots. We want to return things to a time closer to our founding fathers, where government wasn't about control and manipulation, and it certainly wasn't frickin' monetized. You know what? I would love to be monetized a little bit. I could put that into some good uses. But the way you can help me is you just share this. You let people know to say, hey, there's this weird dude who every now and then spits some really good truth. And his name? Yeah, Kid Copious. I'm Purple State Party, and so are you. Love one another. Keep on grinding. Oh my, I'm so happy I finished today. So let's dance it out.